Okay, this is a lecture on the family life cycle. And the basic concept here is that we talk about the individual life cycle in courses like lifespan development, where we talk about the life cycle from infancy through late life. Families also go through developmental stages. And the basic argument here is that families who develop problems, particularly children and adolescents with problems, there would be clinical problems such as younger kids, defiance, older kids, perhaps depression, eating disorders, and the like. These occur, according to family life cycle theory, because the way that the family is organized doesn't work well, or its organization is maladaptive, given the types of challenges associated with particular stages of the life cycle. So, for example, uh, a couple that is rigidly organized around gender roles may be able to function okay until they have their first child, and this rigid organization around gender roles may lead to or contribute to postpartum depression on the part of the new mother. Um, when adolescents and young adults are developing greater independence and in young adulthood leaving home, um, this can go very smoothly, or it can be the source of considerable conflict and problems. Again, how the family is organized will play a major role in that transition. And people like Jay Haley argued in his early work that child, adolescent, and young adult mental health problems are tied to families' difficulty in traversing a particular lifestyle period. So here are the stages. I think these are pretty straightforward. It typically begins with the young adult leaving home, and then their young adults formation of relationships, having children, raising children, children leaving home in adulthood, and then oftentimes the post-child rearing couple may then turn their attention to taking care of an aging parent. In much later life, particularly in couples who've been together for a long time, the challenge in the life cycle may be deteriorating health and caregiving for a spouse, say with conditions like Alzheimer's, dementia, and how a widow or widower responds to the loss of their spouse. This is, I think, very interesting. It's a bit dated, but it holds up pretty well. This is how time is used by couples without kids, couples with young children, couples with school age to young adolescent children, and finally older children, presumably young adult children. And you can see that there are gender differences that are particularly pronounced when the couple has young children under the age of 5, whereby female heads of households, or females in coupled relationships, that's more accurate. Females in coupled relationships spend significantly more time than their male partners in managing and parenting as well as in housework. Okay? This differential remains throughout the lifespan, but is probably most pronounced when there are young kids. And incidentally, in families, in cultures or countries such as the former Soviet Union, aka now including Russia and a bunch of other smaller countries, women have been in the workforce for a longer period of time than men, and you still, however, see this distribution of workload at home. And it's often been said that women essentially have two jobs in these countries. This is probably not the world's greatest graph, but what it is showing is that families or couples may have certain areas of weakness. This basically divides it into expressive resources, which would be things like communication skills, and instrumental resources, which would be things like income. Okay. And also includes the level of dissatisfaction that the family or couple experiences with respect to instrumental resources, again, such as income. And that you can see that that the family's level of stress, or what they call vulnerability to stress, is affected by the balance and adequacy of both expressive and instrumental resources. So when there are problems with expressive resources, communication, emotional support, stuff like that, these seem to be associated with the greatest stress when young adults are leaving home. You can also see that instrumental resources are the biggest source of stress in the early child rearing days, including having school-age kids. And this makes some sense in that it's got the husband's age again at the bottom, that in the early to mid-30s, the financial strains, particularly those associated with having children, are at their greatest. And if you are familiar with the conceptual models that we sometimes use for psychopathology, such as schizophrenia, it's kind of helpful to think about these deficits as diatheses. In this case, they're not genetic, as is the case in schizophrenia. In this case, the diatheses are pre-existing weaknesses in, again, instrumental or expressive resources. And this slide kind of summarizes that. Some core competencies are emotional expression and being able to obtain support from important others, be it parents, be it spouse. Instrumental support, again, concrete help, finances, things like that. And one of the things that we found in our own research with young adults is that maintaining this balance of closeness, being supportive of young adults, while encouraging appropriate independence and development of young adults' own identity and interests. Um, this again, I think, summarizes what I was just talking about earlier. The ways that this is the third point on the slide. The ways that families operate, their prevailing rules. For example, there are families where direct expression of emotion is strongly discouraged, and emotion is often suppressed, are going to have difficulty in phases of the life cycle, like the loss of a parent, for example, um, where emotional expression is certainly common and probably necessary to move through that loss in a healthy way. Okay, so we're now starting to go through the life cycle itself. One of the things that we know is that cohabitation, meaning living with somebody and not being, quote, legally married, or living with somebody and not viewing formally viewing the relationship as a long-term committed relationship, is pretty common. There used to be a lot of research saying that people who lived together before they got married were more likely to get divorced. That's research is no longer the case, or probably even relevant, since the majority of people who get married have lived together before getting legally married. So that's the old data. And one of the reasons that association between marriage and cohabitation and divorce is no longer really valid is that most relationships prior to marriage involve cohabitation. But you do see at the bottom of this slide that there are a minority of folks who have lived together for more than 5 years without being legally married. Um, there's some various reasons for this, and we'll talk about those in just a bit. So this is the old data. Showing somewhat higher rates of what they term marriage failure associated with cohabitation. And since the 1990s, however, this association between premarital cohabitation and divorce has pretty much washed out. It's not there. Now, this is, however, a caveat, and I think this is interesting. Um, if you have been in more than one cohabiting relationship before getting married, meaning that you cohabited with somebody other than the person who became your spouse, if you have had more than one cohabiting relationship, it still is predictive of the likelihood of marital dissolution or divorce. So, does cohabitation by itself, is it associated with divorce? When it's the same partner that you have cohabitated with that you marry, no. However, when you've had other cohabiting relationships prior to the person that you eventually marry, yes, it does. And one of the things that is an issue with cohabiting relationships is because there's no legal definition of the relationship, cohabiting relationships are open to many interpretations, and it's very likely that each partner in a cohabiting relationship may view the relationship's meaning differently. differently. So sometimes it's just utilitarian. It's cheaper for two people to live together than one. It may be an intimate relationship with emotional commitment, an exclusive relationship, but not, there's really been no real discussion about marriage. It may be a trial. Let's see how this works. If it works out okay, we'll get married. It also may be a prelude to marriage, kind of what we've been talking about. You live with your partner before you get married. And then there are still some people around who, this was probably more common in the 70s, who see it as an alternative to marriage. In the 70s, it was not uncommon to hear people say, well, I don't need a piece of paper to certify that my relationship is serious. Sometimes people, particularly you'll see this with older people, may be an alternative to marriage for financial reasons. For example, if somebody is a widow or widower and receiving financial benefits from their ex-spouse's insurance or other source, there may be a financial disincentive to get married, since those benefits may stop if the person remarries. This is data on cohabiting relationships. The average cohabiting relationship, is about a year and a half. There is a pattern of what's called relationship churning. Oftentimes you'll see that means that people have multiple cohabiting relationships. About half of these are over in 5 years. And I think importantly for thinking about the perspective of children is that most step-parent relationships, most blended families often begin as cohabiting relationships. About a third of births of children occur in the context of cohabiting relationships, and it's estimated that about half of kids in the U.S. at least will reside in a cohabiting household. This is probably higher in certain other countries. For example, the province of Quebec in Canada has a particularly high rate of cohabitation in non-marriage. You'll also see this in Scandinavia. So one of the issues, as I said before, is defining the relationship. And I'm going to walk through this case a bit with you, but I'd like to discuss it face-to-face in class. These are two relatively young adults where the woman, Julie, is somewhat older than her partner. They've been living together for 4 years with Julie's daughter from a previous relationship. The relationship was very intimate and emotionally and physically close for the first 2 years, but has not been so in about the last year or so. And this is also an interesting issue in cohabiting relationships. Do you go spend holidays with one of the partner's families, or do you maintain some degree of separateness where holidays come around, each person kind of goes their separate ways to their separate family? So again, I'm coming back to this. We'll talk about it. What does this mean? How do you approach something like this if a couple like this comes for therapy? One of the things that still holds up when you look at cohabitors as a population, and again, this is probably a little less pronounced than it was, is there seems to be less commitment to relationships, more value on individual independence, and problem solving and communication skills are not as good. So again, if you are not legally entangled and you are having conflicts, there are few legal deterrents to walking away from the relationship. This I thought was also interesting. This is also young adults the extent to which they're giving and receiving support, it's usually financial support, from their own parents. And again, you'll see that it's somewhat higher, but not a great deal higher, among married couples. So what do you have to do in a newly established couple's relationship? Well, you have to establish boundaries as a couple, namely, very basic rules. If you're having conflict with your partner, don't get on the phone to your mom or dad and complain about it. Maintaining your own individual interests and identity and that being acceptable. So he loves the outdoors. She really does not. And rather than fighting about that difference, accepting that those are differences and supporting those differences in each other. Establishing routines, who's responsible for the groceries, how our finances handled, how our household duties handled, negotiating those kinds of things. So, particularly in newly married couples, one of the big challenge is the over-involvement of the family of origin, particularly the over-involvement of of the adult partner's parents in the relationship. Also, relationship to in-laws. Despite all the stuff you hear about welcome to the family, etc., in-law relationships, particularly in the United States, are likely to have less closeness and greater degree of distance than relationships with one's own parents. And then you've got the typical issues that lead to conflict, frequency of sex, how money is managed, what you do as a couple recreationally. And John Gottman's research has shown that a big important skill is communication and conflict resolution. And this involves staying engaged with a partner when differences are present. Men in heterosexual relationships have much more difficulty with this, and they're more likely to do something called stonewall, which we'll talk about. And one of the reasons that Gottman has concluded this occurs particularly more commonly among men is that the emotional arousal, and they measure this in a lab by having couples discuss some difference between them, increased heart rate, those kinds of things, are more distressing to men, and they try to manage that physiological distress by interpersonally and emotionally disengaging. Okay, so the old stereotype of a woman trying to get her male husband to engage with her while he's hiding behind the newspaper or watching sports on TV, and him grunting in return may have some adaptive significance. Unfortunately, this stonewalling process also leads to long-term relationship dissatisfaction and divorce. And what they found, Gottman found in his research, is that, as you can expect, in the short run, these exchanges are distressing and make one, in the short run, less satisfied with one's relationship. However, what they found in their research is that, again, it's usually men. If men remain engaged during the discussion of differences, even though it's uncomfortable for them, it gets more comfortable for them with time. Usually, it takes a couple of years, actually. And they become more comfortable discussing differences. This is just a very good example of the type of issue that needs to be ironed out early in the course of a marriage or close relationship. This is recently a married couple. They have a limited amount of vacation time. She's from a very large family. He's the only child. Since the time is limited and they don't live near their families, she thinks that vacation should be used to visit family. He, on the other hand, thinks that their limited vacation time should be a time to relax, and believes that um, vacationing with one's in-laws is an oxymoron, so to speak, and that vacation time should not be spent with one's parents or in-laws. So we'll talk about this more in class, but these are from Gottman's research, the 4 behaviors that predict marital dissatisfaction and divorce. Um, and the one that has the strongest predictive power is contempt. This I've just talked about. Again, a key skill, particularly early in relationships, is conflict resolution. Here are the basics of healthy conflict resolution, and these are things that are taught to the couple. No name calling. You are a complete jerk. You are insensitive. You, anytime you're using the word you at the beginning of a sentence in these exchanges, it's a problem because the only perspective you can speak from is your own. So, I statements. So, making statements like, you are irresponsible, you don't care about me, is a is off the table. It should be replaced with statements like, when I see you look down when we're talking, or looking at your phone when I'm talking to you about something serious, I feel shut out and like what I'm saying is not important. The other thing is threats to leave the relationship or just stomping out in the middle of an argument or disagreement is also off the table. And the issue is to stay engaged, actively listen, being able to paraphrase or summarize what your partner is saying, and also being able to separate the issue from the person, being able to look at the source of difference um, as simply that, a source of difference or a position, rather than saying that it characterizes a person. Saying you're too dependent upon your parents, you really have not been able to commit to our relationship because you're still very committed to your parents. That's not helpful. Saying that it seems like it's important to you to spend a lot of time with your parents, brothers and sisters. I don't disagree with that. I am uncomfortable spending the amount of time with them that we have been. Gottman has also found that couples over time develop these styles, and what's interesting about this is some of what you might expect in terms of the success of relationships, what you might expect intuitively, doesn't seem to hold up in research. I'm going to jump down to the last one, intense intimacy. These are folks who do have frequent conflicts, and there's a fair amount of emotionality in them. However, they're able to resolve them. Some couples, jumping up to the top, because they find the conflict uncomfortable, end up with a solution of leading basically parallel lives. And you may know people like this who've basically been married a long time, but essentially live in the same house, and maybe share expenses, but there's very little emotional connectedness between them. The companionate style is what we usually think as being the most healthy, and that is situations where there's low conflict. Um, we just love one another. We don't have any significant differences. Um, Gottman points out that that probably is okay, probably can work, but it's likely that one or both partners are um, minimizing differences that they may have with their spouse, and they're sort of living lives that are not perhaps completely authentic. And then there's high conflict without attachment. Those are the situations that are going to lead to divorce or certainly low levels of marital satisfaction. And I'm going to show you some of these videos. So we move along through the life cycle. One of the things you find is that, and Gottman's found this too, when couples have their first child, conflict increases. And this kind of makes some sense. Um, Certainly, your approach to child rearing is likely to be influenced by your own experience as a child growing up. And it's interesting, and often we'll say this when I work with couples and families, some parents basically do what their own parents did because they found it was helpful and beneficial. Others say, I'm going to do the exact opposite. I don't want to put my kids through what my parents put me through. And then some pick and choose. Yeah, I agree with this aspect. No, I don't agree with that. But they have found that when you have a child, intimacy is likely to decline, relationship satisfaction declines, um, and just general positivity in the relationship declines. When you tunnel into that a little bit more deeply, what you find is that the decline in marital satisfaction associated with a child is greater for women, and when you compare women who are in a marriage or committed relationship who have kids with those who don't have kids, relationship satisfaction declines more for those with kids. Well, there is this major decline in relationship satisfaction associated with having children. Here are some things that can be done based on research to reduce that, quote, normal decline. Um, in addition to passionate commitment, there has to be sort of a friendship as well in the couple's relationship. And a lot of this is on the part of again, in heterosexual couples, the male's perspective. Men who report a lot of admiration for their partner and just fondness. I admire, I care about this person. They're really an inspiration to me at times. That seems to reduce relationship distress and decline in satisfaction. Cognitive room means that I appreciate that my spouse does some things that I wouldn't do. My own general rule has been through life and as a therapist, unless I think it's harmful to them or the relationship, while I may not understand why something is important to them, if it seems to be and it's not harmful, it's important to support it. Also, the biggie has been, again, in heterosexual couples, the extent to which men are involved in childcare and household responsibilities. You saw at the beginning of this lecture that is often an issue. Um, if men who are more involved in household and childcare tend to be in relationships with higher levels of satisfaction. Um, Now things get probably a little less evidence-based and more theoretical. As kids become older, pre-existing issues around children may come to the fore. Um, Particularly when it's issues around discipline, the amount of independence that children should have. This may be associated with conflicts between parents. I think most parents can agree on your child should not play in the street in the middle of heavy traffic. I don't think that's a toughie. However, whether or not they should spend the weekend overnight with a friend and can be a little iffier. Incidentally, couples also need to have boundaries between themselves and their kids. And one of the best questions to ask I've found in couples and family therapy is to ask a couple, when was the last time you did something by yourselves as a couple without your children? Occasionally you will have couples, particularly those in therapy, who think you're uttering blasphemy. Oh, we include our kids in everything. That's a problem. Adolescence, again, big issue here is independence. Um, and teenagers are establishing boundaries. One of the interesting, I think, metaphors that I've encountered in therapy is when a teenager asks for a lock on their bedroom door. Again, for some families, that is just absolute heresy. We're so close, we should never have to do that kind of thing. And also, sexuality becomes an issue. Um, Perhaps there are latent issues in the sexual relationship between parents. Oftentimes, that part of the relationship is cooled off, particularly with having kids. And adolescent sexuality may bring this to the fore again. One of the things that they've found also in looking at the family life cycle is that the adolescent years, families with adolescents, that tends to create more conflict and more stress for fathers than mothers. And my hypothesis is that issues around independence, autonomy, and self-direction may be more threatening to fathers than mothers. Launching, this means young adults going off on their own. For couples is usually not a big deal. In most research done in the United States, it shows that after young adults leave home, marital satisfaction increases. However, a couple that has been child focused for 18 to 20 years and longer, if there's multiple kids, may need to renegotiate their relationship because it's been focused on kids. Now they're no longer there to focus on. And so how their relationship functions may need to be a topic of discussion. When parents age themselves, and I'm speaking now here from the perspective of adult children, sometimes there's attempts to address the relationship, particularly if it's been not very good. And if young adult children felt that their parents were critical or didn't agree with how they handled things, felt that parents suppressed their drive for independence, these issues may come back up, particularly as older adults become more dependent upon their adult children. When that dependence becomes greater, for example, when an aging mother moves into their adult child and their spouse's home, it may emerge as the aging parent is particularly critical, oftentimes of their son or daughter's partner. The death of a parent is oftentimes a major challenge to one's identity and prompts a lot of self-reflection. It certainly makes you more aware that your own life is limited, and you may look at it and do some serious introspection about whether or not you've lived the way you want to, and perhaps the types of things you've not done with your life that you would like to. Now, for some, the death of a parent can be a very freeing experience. I worked with a lot of Catholic priests and nuns in the past, and occasionally I will hear, Mom, when Mom passed away, I left the priesthood 6 months later. I never could have done that while Mom was alive. It would have been devastating to her. Well, she's gone, so I don't have to worry about that. For the couple in mid to later life, one of the big issues, there's two big issues, I think. One is retirement, and they found in general that individuals who choose to retire rather than those who are forced into retirement by layoff, job loss, those kinds of things, those who choose to retire tend to do better, psychologically speaking. It's rare now for companies to have policies. It used to be the case that companies would have policies that you had to retire by 65, for example. The other thing is the health status. What kind of impacts that have on the marriage? Generally speaking, if the couple is physically healthy, and has been together now maybe 30, 40 years, relationship satisfaction increases. One last point, and I'm going to give you a little data from Canada, and there's data in the United States. One of the things that has happened is that there's been an increase in the percentage of kids who are raised by grandparents. In Canada, and I put this up as an example, First Nations kids are overrepresented in what they call skip generations, where kids are being raised by grandparents. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. Sometimes it's been that a parent may have needed to move away for a job. Sometimes parents have been incarcerated. Sometimes there are situations where the child may be threatened to be removed from the parental household because of abuse or neglect, and grandparents step in to take care of the child and keep them in the extended family. One of the things, however, they've also found is that kids who are being raised by grandparents are more likely to have behavioral problems, more likely to have medical problems, more likely to be, quote, more demanding. And when they have looked at the impact on grandparents of raising their grandchildren, you can see that there are a number of problems associated with it. And support for grandparents in this situation historically has not been very great. Now, another caregiving relationship is that of caregiving from adult children to their own parents who have developed neurocognitive problems like dementia. And this data that I have up there is data for the caregivers, usually middle-aged adults who are caring for a parent who has a condition like Alzheimer's. And it has been said in the medical literature that when an adult is caring for their aging parent, you have two patients, and you should pay attention to both of them. So when an adult brings their aging parent to a physician, and the aging parent has conditions like Alzheimer's, it's important to assess presence of mental health problems and physical health problems in the caregiver.